See, the problem with her theology is that she's unbalanced. She understands God's sovereignty. She understands that God is doing, she understands that God is doing, that He's causing all of these things. She believes in the sovereignty of God, but there's a couple issues where she's missing. One of them is she doesn't see any responsibility of hers in this at all. Okay, God had warned His people that if they disobeyed Him, He would bring famine. They were sinful and they were rebellious, and God simply did what He said He was going to do. God had also warned His people not to seek the aid of the Moabites. He promised that death would happen quickly if they did, and death visited this family just as God had promised. But Naomi doesn't see any fault of their part in the events that took place, and so because of that, she's not brought to repentance or even an acknowledgement of her sin. Psalm 119:71, the psalmist says this. He says, it was good for me that I was afflicted, that I might learn your statutes, that I might learn your word, that I might learn you. It was good for me that I was afflicted. Naomi doesn't see any of the failures in this, and so she isn't brought to that place. She's not brought to repentance, and because of that, she fails to see God's grace in the situation. She sees none of what God is doing as good. Listen to me. She sees sovereignty, yes, but she sees sovereignty without compassion. She sees justice, but she doesn't see mercy. She sees providence, but she doesn't believe that God is good in this, that God is working for her good. She doesn't see grace. And that, friends, is dangerous. Because we have to be able to see clearly. We have to be able to see, yes, God is sovereign and He's good. If you're in a place where you're wrestling with these ideas of sovereignty, may I remind you, that is nothing to be afraid of because God is good. He's just and He's gracious. But would you stand with me for the reading of God's Word? For the sake of context this morning, I'm actually just going to start at verse 1, and we will read all 22 verses of chapter 1. It says, in the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, and a man of Bethlehem in Judah went to sojourn in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. The name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife Naomi, and the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in Judah. They went into the country of Moab and remained there. But Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. These took Moabite wives. The name of one was Orpah, and the name of the other Ruth. They lived there about 10 years, and both Mahlon and Chilion died, so that the woman was left without her 2 sons and her husband. Then she arose with her daughters-in-law to return from the country of Moab, for she had heard in the fields of Moab that the Lord had visited His people and given them food. So she set out from the place where she was with her 2 daughters-in-law, and they went on the way to return to the land of Judah. But Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, go, return each of you to her mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me. The Lord grant that you may find rest, each of you, in the house of her husband. Then she kissed them, and they lifted up their voices and wept. And they said to her, no, we will return with you to your people. But Naomi said, turn back, my daughters. Why will you go with me? Have I yet sons in my womb that may become your husbands? Turn back, my daughters, go your way, for I am too old to have a husband. If I should say I have hope, even if I should have a husband this night and should bear sons, would you therefore wait till they were grown? Would you therefore refrain from marrying? No, my daughters, for it is exceedingly bitter to me for your sake that the hand of the Lord has gone out against me. And they lifted up their voices and wept again. And Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. And she said, see, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Return after your sister-in-law. But Ruth said, "Do not urge me to leave you or to return from following you. For where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts me from you." And when Naomi saw that she was determined to go with her, she said no more. So the two of them went on until they came to Bethlehem. And when they came to Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them. And the women said, "Is this Naomi?" She said to them, "Do not call me Naomi, call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. I went away full, and the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi when the Lord has testified against me, and the Almighty has brought calamity upon me?" So Naomi returned, and Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, with her, who returned from the country of Moab, and they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest. He who has ears to hear, let him hear. Father, we thank you. Amen. You may be seated. This last week, I read about a place in Alaska, a lovely little town. It's actually the northernmost town in the United States. It's called Point Barrow, Alaska. For some, it might be a wonderful place to live. You'll have to decide if this is the place for you. They have a population of around 4,000 people that live there. Temperatures in this place, basically from December to March, never get above 0 degrees, right? So some of you are already like, nope, I'm out, not a chance. This is the deal breaker for me. A jar of peanut butter there will cost you about $30, right? As somebody who goes through about a jar of peanut butter a week, that's a deal breaker for me, right? The sun will set in mid-November and will not rise again until January, right? So it's just, I mean, think about it. It's dark, it's cold, it's an incredibly hard place to live. I feel like I could handle the dark and the cold, but the peanut butter, again, that's a staple in my diet. Most of us would probably sit there freezing alone in the dark, cradling our jar of peanut butter, unsure of what to do or just kind of waiting for the sun to rise. A lack of sunlight, we all know this, a lack of sunlight is a difficult thing. That's a hard place to live. I remember I spent years of my life up in the Pacific Northwest, Portland, up in that area, and I'm just telling you, there are months where you don't see the sun. It's just gray and overcast and dreary and rainy all the time. That in itself would be difficult enough, but imagine living in a place where it's literally dark. The sun's not even out. And that's really, in a sense, where we find the characters in our story today. We recall from last week that this place takes place during the time of the Judges, which is one of the darkest times in Israel's history. There was a famine in the land of Israel, and we saw from Deuteronomy 28 that the productivity of the land was proportional to their obedience to God. So the fact that there was a famine, the nation as a whole had forsaken God. They had started seeking after the gods of their neighboring countries and all the idolatry that was around them. They had begun to embrace that. We saw how Elimelech, this Jewish man from Bethlehem, leaves Israel because of the famine. He leaves the promised land and moves to this cursed land of Moab with his wife Naomi, with his sons Chilion and Mahlon, and then of course when they get there, they're there for a certain amount of time, we don't know, and he dies, and then his two sons, Chilion and Mahlon, they each marry non-covenant, non-Jewish Moabite women, and then they die. And Naomi, you can imagine, is devastated, obviously. And she's so devastated that we're going to see she's not thinking clearly. She's become embittered, and she's struggling in the midst of this. I mentioned last week, of course, this is a love story, and it's a love story that's about hope. That's one of the most prominent themes that we really got into last week, because it's a hope in the providence of God. In the midst of calamity, that God is at work, even in the darkest of times, times so that we living here don't lose hope when everything seems to go wrong. Because for Naomi and for Ruth, everything has gone wrong. And again, this book serves as an example to show us what God was doing in the darkest of times. In this instance, he is preparing for the most important event in the universe, which is the coming of Jesus. Everything is moving toward that. Everything is culminating toward that point. And we are allowed in the story to see a little window into what God is doing. And so we will see his providential hand in all of the bad stuff. When it looks like everything has gone wrong. You know what I'm talking about? Where like everything in your life has gone wrong, and then maybe you see a light at the end of the tunnel, but then the light turns out to be a train coming at you. These are the circumstances that are rough, but we know that God is doing stuff. He's doing things, and so we will watch the providence of God. We will watch him work his sovereign will. And my prayer again for us this morning, similar to last week, is that we would see by faith, if necessary, the invisible hand of Almighty God working for the glory of his name, and by extension, working for your eternal good in the longest and in the darkest nights of our lives. I was thinking about Romans 8:32 says that he who did not spare his own son, but gave him up for us all, how will he not also with him graciously give us all things? Paul's argument here is that God has already done the most costly thing that he could do for you in giving you Jesus. Like, what do you think he's going to withhold now? There's nothing he's going to withhold, because like, what do you envision is going to restrain God from working in the calamities of your life? The answer is nothing. He gave Jesus. Now, just a kind of a side note. I mentioned last why the book of Ruth comes after the book of Judges. Anybody remember that? Because it happens during the time of the Judges. That's why. That's true in our English Bible. That's why it's where it's at. In the Hebrew Bible, though, Ruth is actually in a different location than it is in our English Bibles. It actually the book of Ruth comes immediately after the book of Proverbs. Right? And so in the book of Proverbs, we see wisdom being personified in that, and there's this beautiful structure in the layout of the Hebrew text that we obviously fail to see in the English because it's just not in this order. But in the final section, in the final chapter of Proverbs, in Proverbs 31, we see this acrostic on what is a worthy or what is a virtuous woman. Verse 10 says, who could find her? And then goes on to describe what this worthy, virtuous Proverbs 31 woman is like. And I want to pick this up a little bit just because I want you to see something. Proverbs 31, we'll pick it up in verse 25 and just read through to the end of the book. But it says, strength and dignity are her clothing, and she laughs at the time to come, meaning all of the unknown and the fearfulness and the scary stuff that's off into the future. This Proverbs 31 woman looks at it with strength and dignity, and she's not freaked out about it. She's not panicking. She's not growing cynical. She literally looks at that and she laughs because she knows that God is in control. She opens her mouth with wisdom, and the teaching of kindness is on her tongue. I am convinced that is one of the missing elements of our modern Christianity. We get a lot of things right, and unfortunately, there's a lot of Christians that just aren't kind, right? She's kind. Kindness is on her tongue. She looks well to the ways of her household and does not eat the bread of idleness. Her children rise up and call her blessed. Her husband also, and he praises her. Many women have done excellently, but you have surpassed them all. Charm is deceitful and beauty is vain, but a woman who fears the Lord is to be praised. Give her of the fruit of her hands, and let her works praise her in the gates. And then that's the end of the book of Proverbs. And in the Hebrew Bible, you would immediately turn the page after reading that, and you would be presented with Ruth. In fact, the very language used in Proverbs 31 about this acrostic, the worthy or the worthy or virtuous woman, in Ruth chapter 3, verse 11, Boaz tells Ruth and just uses this exact same language, says, "And now, my daughter, do not fear. I will do for you all that you ask, for my fellow townsmen know that you are a worthy woman." Uses that same language from the end of Proverbs 31 and brings that into this context. And so Ruth, the Moabite, is given as a person, as an example of the embodiment of this amazing woman in Proverbs 31. Ruth is going to be praised in the city gates, which is a tremendous irony when we understand the depravity of the Moabites, when we understand the evil wickedness of the Moabite nation as a people. Moab was cursed by God as a nation. They actually began as the result of an incestuous relationship by Lot's daughters with their drunken father, and the older daughter, they got Lot drunk and then slept with him, and they had a boy, and she named that boy Moab. That's in Genesis 19. And Moab, that boy was the beginning of this people group, and they rejected the living God. Moab was a idolatrous nation. They actually worshipped a false god named Chemosh, right? The Ammonites, who lived just to the north of Moab, they actually were also the result of an incestuous relationship, because the younger daughter of Lot did the same thing the next night, got pregnant by her father, and that's where the Ammonites came from. And they also worshiped Chemosh, but they referred to him by a different name, by the name Molech. But these people group, they worshiped this false god, and the way that they did it was by offering their children as human sacrifices. They had a giant bronze statue that was Chemosh. It was the head of a bull, the body of a man. He sat on this throne, and he was hollowed out on the inside. And what they would do is they would build fires inside of this thing, and so the whole statue was glowing red hot, and then they would come and lay their children on the outstretched arms to burn to death as a sacrifice to this pagan deity. This is demonic. This is demonic. In 2 Kings chapter 23, the author refers to the abomination of Moab. This is what he's talking about. They were a constant enemy of Israel. They were always hostile to the people of God. Listen to me. I don't know how to, I'm trying not to brush anything under the rug. We need to understand how bad this was. This was an evil, pagan, monstrous group of people. They were a cursed nation. And the reason we need to see how bad it is, because it is out of that depravity and out of that cursedness that God's sovereign, undeserved grace falls on a Moabite. Like, we need to see that. Verse 6 tells us that from the fields of Moab, Naomi hears that God has visited his people back in the promised land, and she decides to return. She's going to walk basically from the high plateaus of Moab. She's going to, which were east of the Dead Sea, and she's going to drop down to basically about 5,000 feet in elevation. She's going to drop down to the Dead Sea basin, and then she's going to try to get around the Dead Sea and then have to climb back up the mountains to get to Bethlehem, probably climb about 3,500 or so feet in elevation. This was a long journey. It was very steep both ways. It was rocky terrain. Probably would have taken these women about 10 days to get there, and they would have been exhausted by the time that they arrived. This would have been a difficult journey. Verse 7 says, "So she set out from the place where she was with her 2 daughters-in-law, and they went on the way to return to the land of Judah." This is a beautiful word in the Hebrew language. It's translated a couple different ways in the Hebrew, but it's the Hebrew word shuv. Okay, this is your Hebrew word of the day. Everybody say shuv. Okay? Shuv. As I said, it's a beautiful word. In chapter 1 alone of the book of Ruth, this word shuv, or derivatives of it, are used actually 12 times in just the first chapter. Enough times that the word really stands out in the original language because you're reading it and it's like shuv, 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 shuv. And you can't help but think about that because as you finish chapter 1 reading it, your mind is just going to go shuv, shuv, shuv. Like that's intentional. And it's because shuv, I think, is one of these words that has so much meaning to it. I just want to kind of give you a taste of how this word is used because we need to understand the import of what's happening here. In Psalm chapter 7, verse 12, the psalmist says this: if a man does not shuv, God will whet his sword. He has bent and readied his bow. In Psalm 22:27, it says, all the ends of the earth shall remember and shuv to the Lord. And all the families of the nations shall worship before you. In Psalm 23:3, it says, he shuvs my soul. He shuvs my soul. He leads me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. In 1 Kings chapter 8, verse 33, it says, when your people Israel are defeated before the enemy because they have sinned against you, and if they shuv to you and acknowledge your name and pray and plead with you in this house, and goes on to deliver some amazing promises. In Isaiah 31, the prophet says, shuv to him from whom people have deeply revolted, O children of Israel. Hosea chapter 6 verse 1 says, come, let us shuv to the Lord, for he has torn us that he may heal us. He has struck us down and he will bind us up. And so we see back in Ruth chapter 1 verse 7 the use of this word shuv. So she set out from the place where she was with her two daughters-in-law, and they went on the way to Shuv, to the land of Judah. And it's a beautiful picture of repentance, right? She had left the covenant land of Israel with her husband, but now she is shuving, right? She's shuving. She's returning. In fact, part of the meaning of that word repent that we talk about so much is it means to turn around. It means to do an about face. They had came to Moab, and now she's turning back to turning her back on Moab. She's going back to the covenant God, the true God, Yahweh, where because he has blessed his people back in Bethlehem. And so she's shuving. Right? And by the way, if I could add this, that is always the quickest way back to God. To turn around. To shuv. Right? You say, oh, well, I feel so far from God. Well, turn around. Right? Turn around. You'll find him. Repent. You'll find him there. Acts chapter 3, verse 19 says, repent. Repent, therefore, and turn back. Everybody say, shuv. Shuv, that your sins may be blotted out. You say, oh, but I've walked 10,000 steps. I've gone for years in the opposite direction, and there's been so much that has happened, and I've been in Moab, and I don't even know the way back. Well, guess what? It's really easy. Turn around. Shuv. It's one step to get back. And we have this wonderful promise from 1 John chapter 1, verse 9. If we confess our sins, if we shuv, he's faithful and just to forgive us our sins and cleanse us from all unrighteousness. It's easy. You turn around and you say, Lord, I'm sorry. Forgive me. Heal my heart. Make me new. I want to live for you. I want to live for your glory. I want to live in such a way that I show the world how great and how amazing you are, and you're there. That's all it takes to shuv, to repent. Well, Naomi is returning to the covenant lands, but apparently she doesn't have a lot of confidence that there's going to be much relief for her. And she probably has even less confidence that there's going to be any relief for Orpah and for Ruth. Her family had fled during the famine. It was probably going to be humbling. It was probably going to be a bit humiliating for them to try to go back and return now She was going to have to admit to the people back there who knew her that they had been living among the Moabites for over a decade, that her 2 sons had broken God's covenant and married Moabite women, and God had obviously judged them for their foolishness, right? Now, whether or not that's true, that would have been the Jewish view anyway. They would have came back, well, of course, like we said last week, of course they died. They married people they shouldn't. So how is all of that going to be received when she gets back there? It's possible that Naomi feared that she would be ostracized, even by her own people. She probably thought that she would be unable to care for her daughters-in-law if they followed her back to Judah. Because listen, Bethlehem is not a friendly place if you're a Moabite. It's just not a good place to be. So in verse 8 and 9, it says, Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, "Go, return each of you to your mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me. The Lord grant that you may find rest, each of you, in the house of her husband." Then she kissed them, and they lifted up their voices and wept. It almost seems like Naomi is detaching herself from these other women. She's isolating herself from those that are closest to her, those who have known her the closest for the last 10 years, experienced this trauma. She's pushing them away. And it's interesting because isn't that the temptation that all of us face in our pain, to retreat and to withdraw and to urge others, even our closest friends and relatives, you just leave me alone in my misery. I just need to. Perhaps Naomi realizes that every time she's going to look at her daughters-in-law, that she's going to be reminded of all that she lost in Moab. Perhaps she doesn't see their presence and their relationship as a blessing to enjoy, but more like a burden that she has to bear. There's a structural emphasis at the end of verse 8 that we see. She says, "May the Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me." So she already identifies herself as dead. Her life, as she sees it, is basically over. So we have to understand how hard this is for her to go back. This is hard for her to return to Bethlehem. And we see this in the New Testament. We read about the prodigal son who left his father's house and lived this wicked lifestyle before returning home. You recall how hard it was for the kid to decide to come home. I mean, he literally avoided it for as long as he possibly could. And finally, he's suffering so badly that he realizes that perhaps even as a servant in his father's house, that would be better than all of the angst and turmoil that he's experiencing right now. But of course, he goes back and the story doesn't unfold the way that he expects it to. Because instead of judgment, he's met with grace. Instead of rejection, he's accepted and he's welcomed with a feast. I bet Naomi is thinking along those lines, and she's thinking, it's going to be hard enough for me, but Israel is not a place for 2 widowed Moabite girls. And so she prods them. She looks at them. She says, "Listen, go back to your mom and dad's house. Go back and serve your Moabite gods. Go back to Chemosh." Now, whether she was trying to save face or she was genuinely trying to protect her daughters, we don't know for sure. But once again, she's wrong. Right? She's wrong. Telling her daughters-in-law to return to their gods makes no sense. Naomi is far more concerned about their physical future than their spiritual future. For Naomi, finding relief for their temporary needs was more important than finding relief for their eternal needs. And so in verse 10, they say to her, "No, we will return with you to your people." But Naomi said, "Turn back, my daughters. Why will you go with me? Have I yet sons in my womb that they may become your husbands? Turn back, my daughters, and go on your way, for I am too old to have a husband. If I should say I have hope, even if I should have a husband this night and should bear sons, would you therefore wait till they were grown? Would you therefore refrain from marrying? No, my daughters, for it is exceedingly bitter to me for your sake that the hand of the Lord has gone out against me." Now, Naomi's statements here introduce us to a custom in Jewish culture that is really strange to us. where when certain things like land or freedom or lineage or property were lost or were in danger of being lost, there was a provision for them to be redeemed. We read about this in Deuteronomy 19. We read about this in Leviticus 25. And that duty to redeem these things would fall to the closest living relative. And I say duty because it was required by Mosaic law that the closest of kin would become the redeemer, would become the goel. Okay? And it would be the duty of this kinsman, of this kin, or of this goel to rescue or to redeem or to deliver or to avenge the person or the property that was lost or was in danger of being lost if he had the means to do it. So, if a person came into debt, okay, and he was in danger of losing his family property or was in danger of being sold into kind of like a bond servitude, the goel would come in and pay off the debt, provided that he had the means, and he would rescue that individual from slavery and buy back or redeem the land that was lost so that that land could stay in the family. Now, he couldn't redeem it. He couldn't buy it for himself. In fact, by law, he was not to profit from any of this. He was the goel. If a family member was killed, it was the duty of the goel to hunt down the killer and to avenge his death. If there was a man who died and there was no male heir to take over the family land, the goel would come in, he would step in, he would marry the widow, he would redeem the land back at his own cost, he would provide for the widow and give children to the widow, not for himself, but for the man who died, in order that his lineage, the dead man's lineage, the dead man's name and property would continue. And again, in every one of these cases, the goel was redeeming and gained nothing. He didn't gain land, he didn't gain a bondservant, he didn't even gain a son, because the son that he would give to the widow would take the name of the dead husband. So Naomi's words in verses 12 and 13 kind of helps color that and understand it for us. She says, if I should say I have hope, even if I should have a husband this night and should bear sons, would you therefore wait until they were grown? No, you're not going to wait that long. She's saying, listen, I have no one. Go back to Moab, because in Moab you're not going to be bound by these Jewish laws. You can just go back and pretend none of this happened and marry somebody else and go about your life, and you can still have a happy life. Don't come with me. I'm too old to be able to have sons that could redeem you. I have no one. I'm going back to Israel, but I'm going back to nothing. If you come with me, there's no one for us. There's no one that could be a goel and redeem all of this loss, which, as we find out later, that's not true, right? There is somebody. She has Boaz, and she has another relative, we'll find out, that's actually even closer than Boaz. So Naomi's not thinking clearly. She's so distraught and she's so just battered by life circumstances. She's so depressed. She's not thinking clearly. She believes what she's saying is true, probably, but she's not seeing the whole picture. She can't see it. And might I be so bold as to add, listen, when life hits you like this, you're not going to see clearly either. It's not. Not at first, anyway. Which is why church is so essential. It's why covenant gospel community is essential. Because when your world collapses and you feel like God's hand is against you and there's just tragedy after tragedy after trial after trial, when you feel like God's hand is against you and you can't see any of the why in your pain and your emotions are freaking out and your vision is impaired, you will be almost unable to see hope. That happens to all of us. Every single one of us, that happens to us. Naomi could not see hope, and you're going to need people around you to encourage you and to strengthen you and to calm your heart and calm your emotions and help guide you and speak peace to you, not in some cavalier way that's like, oh, it's going to be okay, right? Not like that, but to sit down next to you in your misery and say, hey, I'm here. I'm here. Listen, I know you can't see hope right now, but I'm believing that God is doing something and just speaking life to you. Some of you have friends who have gone through tragedies, and you sit there and be like, I don't know if I can talk to them because I don't know what to say. Sometimes the best thing is not to say anything. Just be there. Just sit next to them. Just cry with them. Just be a friend. Just sit there in their darkness and say, listen, I don't know what to say, and I'm hurting for you, but I'm here, and I'm with you. You will need people in your life that can talk to you like that. And I'm going to go a little bit further and step on some toes and say this. That's why you have to get in a life group. Okay? You've got to cultivate this kind of relationship, because when the lights go out and it's dark for you, you're going to need this kind of relationship. And there's people going through it right now that you could sit next to and speak life to and be a friend. All right, that's enough toes. Verse 14 says, then they lifted up their voices and wept again. And Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, basically said goodbye. She's going back to Moab. It says, but Ruth clung to her. Evidently, sometime during this time, God had moved upon this Moabite woman and had opened her eyes and opened her heart to the depravity of the Moabite nation. God had changed this woman. Verse 15, Naomi says to Ruth, see, look, your sister-in-law, she's gone back. Go with her. Follow her. Return with your sister-in-law. Go after. She's gone back and she's with her family and doing all their stuff back there. Just go. Go. I got nothing for you. And verse 16, Ruth said, do not urge me to leave you or to return from following you, for where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord do so to me and more also, if anything but death parts me from you. Now, freeze frame for just a second. Just freeze the picture. This is one of the most decisive moments in human history. This moment is one of the decisive moments in all of human history. I know it doesn't look like that. It's just a couple of widows standing out on a dirt road in the Middle East having a conversation in a Kleenex moment, right? But this is one of the most decisive moments in all of human history. And that's not saying us, there are huge things that are happening all over the globe right now. Over in Egypt, Pharaoh Ramesses V is about to die of smallpox. That was no small thing for the whole nation of Egypt. Greece is entering into its golden age. In China, the Zhou dynasty is coming into power. In Central and South America, the Mayan dynasty is starting to emerge. And all of these are hugely, historically significant for the culture and the development of the entire world. There's amazing things that are happening that are really, really, really big. And all of them pale in comparison to what is happening here on a dirt road outside Moab. Because if this doesn't play out like God has ordained it, which, by the way, can't happen, right? But if this doesn't play out the way it's supposed to play out, then you better cancel the Magi coming to Bethlehem a millennia later. Because the only reason the Magi come to Bethlehem is because they're going there to see Jesus, because Jesus is born in Bethlehem. And Jesus is born in Bethlehem because David, his ancestor, had been born in Bethlehem. And David was born in Bethlehem because his dad Jesse was born in Bethlehem. And Jesse was born in Bethlehem because his dad Obed was born in Bethlehem. And Obed, the future son of Ruth, was born in Bethlehem because Ruth is going to stand on a dirt road with Naomi and say, stop asking me to go back to Moab. Where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people, my people, your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and that's where I'll be buried. The Lord do more to me. The Lord do terrible things to me. If anything but death parts me from you. Ruth is leaving everything. She's leaving her family, her culture, everything she knows. She is embracing widowhood. As far as she knows, she's never going to marry again. She will never have kids. She's never going to have a family. She's going to live out the rest of her life destitute, a Moabite in Israel, an outsider, a pagan, right? An unknown people, a new language, viewed with disgust and racial animosity, a place where widows were often ignored. The Israelites are going to view her as cursed, and they're going to treat her like she's cursed. She is embracing a life of suffering and loneliness and alienation. It's hard for me to help you understand how hard life in Israel would be, first for a woman, but second for a widow whose husband died in Moab, and lastly for a Moabite widow. In Psalm 108, there's a verse in Psalm 108 that says this. It says, this is God saying this, Judah is my lawgiver and Moab is my washpot. Right? Like my trash can, right? Moab is God's trash can. And what's ironic is the Jews sang that song, right? Like you imagine coming in here on Sunday morning and saying, oh yeah, Moab is God's trash can. It was a catchy tune apparently, and they liked singing it. But she's going to go back to Bethlehem, and listen, Ruth is going to be about as welcome in Bethlehem as a ham sandwich and a side of bacon at a bar mitzvah, right? That's what she's walking back into. Ruth is walking back into Bethlehem with the stigma of a widow, being viewed as God's trash can, had been married to a husband, a Jew, who had disobeyed God's covenant law by going to Moab and marrying you, and then you're going to go live in that culture? Ruth says, I will be buried where you are. In other words, even after you die, I'm not going back to Moab. This is for keeps. If you die and then I live for another 30 years, I'm going to be in Israel and I'll be buried where you are. She says, your God, my God, which is amazing. Because somewhere in those 10 years, God has changed her heart. She's not just expressing devotion to Naomi, she's expressing devotion and faith in Yahweh. She's saying, I renounce all of it. Like, folks, this is commitment. The Hebrew poetic structure, we see something in that you can't see in the English. It frames this in a way that's very clear to the Hebrew reader. Could you throw up that colored one for me? She says, this is Ruth talking. She says, do not urge me to leave you or to return from following you, for where you go I will go, and where you lodge I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, your God my God. Where you die I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts me from you. And so in the Hebrew structure, we see this, that the first and the last sentences actually go together. The second and the fourth sentences actually go together. And the middle one is her profession of faith. It literally reads that your people shall be my people. That's actually not a very good translation. It literally reads, your God, your people, my people. That's what it says. She isn't pledging something in the future. She is stating something that has already happened. She's stating something that is already done. In other words, because your God is my God, because your people are my people, I go with you. And when you see it like this, you begin to understand this is not a commitment to Naomi. This is a display of her commitment to Yahweh and her rejection of all things from Moab. It's arguably the clearest conversion statement in all of the Old Testament. She's saying, the reason I belong with you, Naomi, the reason I belonged with you is because your God is my God. And the language here in Ruth borrows from Leviticus 26 where God says, I will walk among you and be your God and you will be my people. She's borrowing this language. And so she trusts in Yahweh God, even more than Naomi. In spite of Naomi's warnings about the hardship and the bitterness that's coming, she says, I'm going to go to the covenant land because that's my land now. I'm going to be in the covenant people because that's my people now. Which is crazy because you say, who taught her that? Like, what pastor was speaking to her life to give her these words of life and help her understand this? The answer is no one. This was a sovereign act of God coming in and speaking something into the heart of this Moabite. Like, where would she come up with this stuff? This is miraculous. And again, we see Ruth, just this fearless, this is the ideal woman of God, of one who has faith in God, who sees beyond all of the circumstances and the present setbacks and the present difficulties. She is Proverbs 31:25. Strength and dignity are her clothing, and she's not freaked out about the time to come. She's not panicking. She trusts God. She's laughing because she knows God has got this. She is Proverbs 31 personified. In the Old Testament, when a person made an oath or a promise, often they would swear by their God. And notice so at the end of verse 17 that Ruth does not make her oath in the name of Chemosh, but Yahweh, the God of the Israelites. She says, may the Lord do so to me. May Yahweh do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts me from you. Because there's a conversion that has taken place. Ruth is saying that she is going to entrust her future to the God of the Bible, which again, is incredible. It's amazing when you think about all that has happened in her life. This is supernaturally miraculous when you think about the pain, when you think about all the loss that she's experienced, when you think about the hurt. Rather than growing bitter, rather than growing angry, God has supernaturally opened up the heart of this Moabite woman in the midst of all of her hurt and trial to trust in and love him. Verse 18 tells us, when Naomi saw that she was determined to go with her, she said no more. So the two of them went on until they came to Bethlehem. And when they had come to Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred up because of them. And the woman said, is this Naomi? She said to them, do not call me Naomi, which means pleasant. Call me Mara, call me bitter. For the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. She says, I went away full, and the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi when the Lord has testified against me and the Almighty has brought calamity upon me? Now, we talked about this last week. Part of that is true. God has afflicted her. These are bitter providences. I hesitate saying she has good theology. She has incomplete theology. The part that she has is good, right? Because when bad stuff happens, she doesn't assume that God is no longer in control. She doesn't assume, well, Satan is winning today, like there's some kind of duality between God and Satan, and we'll find out who's going to win. Satan always wants bad, and God always wants good, and so if it's bad, obviously Satan's ahead today. She doesn't have that kind of dualistic theology that's heretical, right? She knows that when bad stuff happens, it's a bitter providence. She talks exactly like Job does. In Job chapter 7, verse 20, this is Job's prayer. He's pleading his case before God. He says, if I sin, what do I do to you, you watcher of mankind? Why? This is Job asking God, why have you made me your mark? Why have I become a burden to you? Job understands that the difficulties that he's going through are from the hand of God. In Job chapter 42, verse 11, we see this. This is kind of at the end of the story. It says, then came to him all his brothers and sisters and all who had known him before and ate bread with him at his house, and they showed him sympathy and comforted him, listen to this, for all the evil that the Lord had brought upon him. And each one of them gave him a piece of money and a ring of gold. Naomi talks like Job does and all the other Old Testament writers. But while she does understand that God is sovereign, she's still not seeing clearly. because she doesn't see that all of these evils are not for her destruction, but they are for her deliverance. See, that's our problem too. When we deal with the sovereignty of God, we think, well, it's just terrible. But listen, it's not for your destruction. If you are a believer in Jesus, the difficulties that you encounter are for your redemption. Because God in this story is going to bring the Savior of the world to people, and He's going to do it in Bethlehem. He's going to do it in this town. Micah 5:2, the prophet comes and says, "But you, O Bethlehem Ephrathah, you who are too little to be among the clans of Judah, from you shall come forth one for me, who's going to be ruler of Israel, whose coming forth is from old, from ancient of days." And I read that, and I see what God is doing in all of this, and I see Naomi's bitterness, and I see her struggle, and I see the fact she's not seeing everything, and it's like you want to scream into the pages of Scripture and say, Naomi, if you could only see the plan. If you could only see the plan that God is working in your pain, and He's doing things in your pain and in your hurt and in your loss, and they are things that are good and they're things that are wonderful. Listen, Naomi, He is going to bring the Savior of the world to humanity, and He's going to use your family. That's why all this is happening. See, the problem with her theology is that she's unbalanced. She understands God's sovereignty. She understands that God is doing, she understands that God is doing, that He's causing all of these things. She believes in the sovereignty of God, but there's a couple issues where she's missing. One of them is she doesn't see any responsibility of hers in this at all. Okay, God had warned His people that if they disobeyed Him, He would bring famine. They were sinful and they were rebellious, and God simply did what He said He was going to do. God had also warned His people not to seek the aid of the Moabites. He promised that death would happen quickly if they did, and death visited this family just as God had promised. But Naomi doesn't see any fault of their part in the events that took place, and so because of that, she's not brought to repentance or even an acknowledgement of her sin. Psalm 119:71, the psalmist says this. He says, it was good for me that I was afflicted, that I might learn your statutes, that I might learn your word, that I might learn you. It was good for me that I was afflicted. Naomi doesn't see any of the failures in this, and so she isn't brought to that place. She's not brought to repentance, and because of that, she fails to see God's grace in the situation. She sees none of what God is doing as good. Listen to me. She sees sovereignty, yes, but she sees sovereignty without compassion. She sees justice, but she doesn't see mercy. She sees providence, but she doesn't believe that God is good in this, that God is working for her good. She doesn't see grace. And that, friends, is dangerous. Because we have to be able to see clearly. We have to be able to see, yes, God is sovereign and He's good. If you're in a place where you're wrestling with these ideas of sovereignty, may I remind you, that is nothing to be afraid of because God is good. He's just and He's gracious. And so you see how her incomplete theology had kind of affected and corrupted her thinking. We see this in the beginning of verse 21. She says, I went away full, and the Lord has brought me back empty. That's not true. It's not true at all. She has Ruth. She has Ruth. She has Boaz. In the last verse of chapter 1, we are given another ray of hope. Given Naomi's bitterness, we know that her actions are not going to be the basis of any hope. If it were left to the one whose name means pleasant, right, there would be nothing but bitterness. But the chapter ends with the hope of a harvest. Verse 22 says, So Naomi returned, and Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law with her, who returned from the country of Moab, and they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest. So the providence of God is working. It's the beginning of the barley harvest. It's the end of April, possibly early May. The wheat harvest is 3 to 4 weeks away. The chapter that begins with a famine is now ending with a harvest. Bethlehem, the house of bread, is about to be full of bread again. And the sovereign God of the universe has overcome the resistance of a young woman from the pagan, cursed land of Moab. And now God, in his providence, is going to work for the good and to guard and to provide for both of these women. This is marvelous, infinite, matchless, sovereign grace, freely bestowed upon undeserving people. Grace that opens eyes, grace that softens hearts, grace that accords with the purposes of God's glory. Listen to me. We have a sovereign God, and we have a gracious and good God. We have a providential God, and we have a kind God. We have a God who directs all things, and we have a God that we don't always understand and see everything, but we can trust that he is good. If you struggle with his sovereignty, listen to me. Don't forget, he is sovereign, but he's good. He's good. Neither of these women deserved God's goodness, but God is good anyway. Listen, if you're here today, whatever's happening in your life, whatever's going on in your brain or your heart, maybe you can't see the goodness of God. Listen, you can look at Naomi and you can see her mistakes. You can look at Ruth and you can see her example. But I would tell you to look to Christ, because I want you to see him. I want you to see him sitting on the throne of the universe, ruling and reigning. I want you to see his sovereignty, but I want you to see especially his undeserved and unearned sovereign grace that falls on people that don't deserve it. Perhaps you're still spiritually, you're still in Moab, hundreds of miles from where you should be. Then the word for you this morning is this: turn around. Shuv, right? Turn around, do an about face, repent, and look to Jesus. Let's pray.